Well, thank you, Kelsey, and welcome to everyone. I'm so glad to see you here. As we've been saying, this is part of our 2022 Research for the Public Good, which is our annual research event at the university. We're highlighting faculty and student research, and so glad to see you here. So this session this afternoon is designed to be participatory. So I am going to ask you to either come off mute and speak at certain points, or type in the chat, and I'll be kind of looking to see what I see over in the chat on my other screen. What we're going to do is look at some situations that arise sometimes in research collaboration, and these are very kind of typical situations, and they can be sticky situations, and I think they make for some good discussion. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about collaborating on research teams, and then get into a couple of these case studies about things that you may encounter as you're working on a research team. And I would love to hear your experiences and insight as we go. So this is cheesy, I know, but researchers are people too. And what I mean by that is that when you're working on a research team, ultimately it's still a team, and the team is composed of people. And from what I've seen, a lot of research teams succeed or fail still just based on the interactions of those people and the extent to which the research team is communicating well and planning well and taking into account the strengths of the people in the group and their roles and responsibilities on the project. So, it's a bit of an obvious statement, but we tend to overlook it sometimes when we're in a project that maybe is very scholarly and rigorous, and we're thinking about all of the research activities, but maybe not the people interactions quite as much. And that's where sometimes we have to be intentional about building some of those planning and relationships during a research project to make things work well. Now, I know from looking at the participant list here, we have lots of project manager type people with a lot of experience in that area. So I was just going to briefly talk about some of the things that you might use for project management, but I would like your suggestions as well in the chat, or if you want to come off of mute. These are just really, really basic things, but you may have some insights for others that they wouldn't have seen before. So of course, it always helps in a particular project to designate who is the project owner for that specific project. And we often call that person the PI or the principal investigator. You'll see that a lot in the IRB language and that kind of thing. That's the person who's really the person in charge of that project, who's helping to run things at a larger level. Now, again, it might seem obvious to designate a project owner, but sometimes, when we're all together and there's maybe a group of people who start off on a project, but it's unclear who's really steering the ship on a particular part of it, that can become muddy, and then it's not clear, who's doing what or who's the one giving direction for that aspect. So having the project owner and designating that person can be really essential. Roles and responsibilities. We had some great discussion about that back at the beginning of the week when we had our panel on collaborating with student researchers. And it's just as applicable no matter who is on your project team to think about the strengths and responsibilities of each person on the team, which aspects of the project they're working on, and what those deliverables and milestones are, and how to keep the project moving, what happens when it gets stuck. And there's some different ways to track on roles and responsibilities. In terms of tracking tools and shared space, these might be like technology tools that you might use. I'd love to see in the chat some tools that you like in terms of project tracking or sharing documents or sharing project pieces. If you have any tools that you really enjoy, I would love to see what those are. So go ahead and pop things in the chat if you have a preferred project tool or preferred sharing tool that has worked well for you on any kind of collaboration. Kelsey saying, I like Evernote. And Google. Google is something that people come back to a lot because it is pretty user-friendly and has a really intuitive interface. We heard earlier in the week with the student panel again that they've been using Slack a little bit for some of their projects, just to have Slack channels that folks can communicate on. OneNote can be really good if that's something you can share across, with your office. Google Docs and Google Sheets. Yeah, a lot of Google because it is a really nice user interface. So there's a lot of tools out there, within the university. We have some shared tools through Office 365, but it really depends on the dynamics of the team and what you can all get to and what's easy to use and what you can track progress and track changes on. So that's something that's worth investigating up front when you're setting up a group project. Is what tools do you want to use and where can you all easily interface with the project and communicate with each other without necessarily having to email everything back and forth if you don't like that. So those are just some really basic things, and I know a lot of you have experience in that area, but it's worth saying not to overlook those things up front, because it's easy when you have a bunch of people working for pieces to get really decentralized or disorganized, and then you go back later and realize, oh, well, that person left, but they had this piece and nobody else has it anymore. So that's something to think about. A shared drive with a project status spreadsheet. Yep, and a weekly scheduled touch base. And Dr. Ed is saying quick base for business. So there's some nice tools out there for you to think about if you're starting to set up a research group with others and you're wanting to just make sure that you have everything in one location. So here's another tool, and I'm going to ask all of my business folks in the room for sure who may know what this stands for. Who before has used a Raci Matrix? I can't see your hands, so you'll have to say yes or put it in there. Yes, Sherry's saying yes. It's probably familiar to some folks. Again, it's just one way of organizing responsibilities, but as you can see from the table, the RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. And you can use this as one mechanism to split up project tasks or phases of the project to look at different roles. So you can see in this one, in the accountable column, that's all the same person. And the accountable column is usually the project owner or the person who's ultimately in charge of that project, who's the buck stops there with that person. So that might be the accountable person on a task, but that person isn't necessarily doing all the tasks, right? So the responsible person is who's doing that task. And so there's different people there, maybe somebody's writing the IRB application and somebody else might be creating the survey, et cetera. So those are the people who are responsible for that task. And then with consulted, that's good for team communication or external stakeholders to say who needs to provide feedback here, or whose permission do we need to get, or those are people who just need to be consulted as these things are happening for whatever that task is. And then informed is we need to let so-and-so know that this is happening right now. So that's more of an informational, but it's a way to break down projects. The tasks that I put here are very, very high level, but you can get more and more and more granular in terms of the level of tasks. And that's just one organizational tool for breaking down parts of a project and thinking about how to make sure you really know who's doing what and whether the right people have been consulted at each stage, and just keeping others in the loop through being informed. And some of those things come in handy as we go into thinking about our case studies. And this is where I'm hoping we have some fun. So I have a couple of case studies here. These are short videos. These are coming from the Office of Research Integrity, which is a federal office that's part of Health and Human Services. And they have a great website that I'll try to show off here before the end that has a lot of resources on it. And one of those resources is some very short video vignettes about aspects of research and thinking through the research process. So I want to give credit to the Office of Research Integrity for creating this video. This is about a 2-minute video. It's about authorship and considerations around authorship. And so what I'd like us to do is, as you're watching it, think about what are the issues here, what can be done at this point with the dilemma that's being presented, and then what might we do in the future to not have that kind of dilemma come up. So I'm going to go ahead and play it and hope that it comes through okay, and then we will discuss at the end.
So I spoke with my old PI Sean last week about the manuscript I'm writing.
What did he say?
Well, he was impressed with our findings and he's excited about the implications.
But
he wants to be listed as an author.
ooh, that could be tricky.
I know. He feels that our research is an offshoot of his work.
Is it?
Well, the work we did inspired this research, but I've long since moved past the ideas we initially discussed.
What was your arrangement when you left this lab?
We didn't have one, but we've always had a good relationship and I don't want to jeopardize that.
So did you agree to be co-authors?
We never discussed it.
That's too bad.
I know, I don't know what to tell him. I mean, the paper might have more clout with his name on it, but then again, his name might overshadow my efforts and make it harder for me to establish a name for myself.
Difficult to say. Who came up with the original idea for this project?
Partly Sean, but mostly me.
Did you work on this project together?
No.
Did you tell him that you'd go in a different direction?
No, we never discussed future collaboration. That's the problem. Now we're in this awkward place. I don't want to burn the bridge. It's too important to me.
The same thing happened to me before with a former colleague. After that, I developed a personal authorship policy.
Oh, that's smart. What was in it?
It's essentially a checklist of all the components necessary to publish a paper. It also helps me to gauge how much someone has contributed to a project. Also, whether that contribution is enough to warrant authorship. Students especially love it because they always want to know what they need to do in order to be on the paper.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I just wish I had done that before I left Sean's lab.
He probably does too.
So I'm going to leave this green up just because there are some other questions on here that are useful to us as well. So this is a tough one about authorship. And if you were listening to the context here, so this guy is a professor, but his former mentor, presumably when he was a postdoc or a graduate student, is expecting to be an author on a current paper that he is publishing now. And the dilemma around that is, well, what does that mean? And is that a good idea to have that other person be an author on the paper? So let's just tease out for a minute, what are some of the dilemmas here that you see in listening to that conversation. So what factors are at play? And you can come off of mute or you can type in the chat. What factors are at play? Intellectual property. Mm-hmm.
I'll make a comment. I had this happen to me when I was getting my PhD, and for 3 years working on the dissertation. My advisor for 3 years, I published about 6 papers before my doctorate, and she insisted her name be the first name on the list. And after I got my doctorate, for 2 years, I would publish and 2 papers. And she said, "I'd like to have my name on it, Oliver." And I put it on there, but then I backed off and stopped talking to her. It became, I just couldn't do it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do at the time. That was back in 1995, and it was really bothersome because she was such a good leader and telling me how to analyze data right and stuff. So I've been through this, and it's difficult. It's difficult. I don't know if anyone has experienced that before. I don't do it now. No, if you got to work on a paper with me, you work on the paper, and we let it be known. Yeah, but I like that form they're talking about. If there's a checklist, that's really cool to do.
Mm-hmm.
It helps get that out of the way. Like, okay, I like that.
Yeah, that was a really powerful story, Oliver, about, especially in the position of being a graduate student with the faculty member, where there's definitely the power dynamics there and who should be an author. So I guess I see Samir has a comment in there that his mentor wanted all the publications with Samir's name as first author. So that's interesting. Let's maybe look into that for a minute, that dynamic, especially as a graduate student faculty member. What do you think were the faculty members' motivations for wanting to be first author on those papers? And anybody can answer that for that one. And I'm talking about Oliver's situation for a minute. Demonstrating current activity, advancement, yeah, rank advancement, like tenure perhaps, ego for sure, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot there, and it is a really difficult position for a student. Yeah, advancement for her, for a student and a faculty member. In the video, even though the person in the video is now independent and off doing his own research, there's still this kind of like parent-child or older research sibling relationship with the former PI that's impacting the dynamics right now. Yeah, Jordan is saying it would come down to how much time. Yeah, there's definitely considerations for being an advisor. So let's talk about then what do you need to think about in terms of who merits being an author on a publication? What criteria would you use for authorship? Oh, thank you, Samir. You're pointing to an awesome website. Does anyone else want to chime in on that? What criteria would you use in order to help determine who gets to be an author? Anyone have thoughts on that? The degree of the actual research, searching and analysis, yeah. Yep, the more of these significant intellectual contribution. Now, I will say in academia, there's a major contribution from data collection to analysis and writing. Thank you, Samir, for writing that. That's a really good summary. So the best practices are to be an author, you really one has to be engaged in the project significantly throughout. It's not enough to be tagged on to the publication just by virtue of influence or knowing. Obviously this happens, and it's a practice that's probably gone on for different reasons, but what things can you do? Let's just flip our paradigm for a moment here, and let's assume you're starting fresh, you're putting together a research group, and your colleagues, you're all peers here at first. What can you do up front to try to mitigate this kind of situation later on? Anything you can do up front to avoid this kind of situation later? Yep, establish a rubric of participation. I love that. A rubric of participation sounds great. Establishing expectation, a percentage of engagement, drafting an agreement, being clear with the expectations. Yep, and keep thorough notes. Who did what happened? Yes, those are excellent points. So it may seem really far away when you're first starting a project. The writing the papers or the presentations down the line might feel distant, and maybe it's not the first thing on your mind, but I think these examples, like this video and things you have brought up, illustrate that it's good to sit down and agree maybe on that checklist or that rubric of authorship up front, and also how each member of the team is going to contribute. And that kind of goes back to the project tasks that we talked about before, how team members are playing into the project and the contributions that they're making throughout the way. It's also maybe a way of thinking about when you have multiple people on a team, and maybe you're starting to get some complex data, like different data sets, or you've been working on projects over a period of time. It's also a good thing to talk about whether members of the team can publish themselves independently on or present themselves. Do they need to include the other team members? Who needs to sign off and approve on publications or presentations that go out? So yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of things to think about up front, but it's definitely worth having that discussion. And you heard from the video, the friend saying, well, now I have an authorship agreement, I have a checklist, and that helps people to know if they're qualified based on the checklist to have done enough to be considered an author. And I saw going by in the chat, I think Samir mentioned order of authorship is also important. So that's also something that can get a little bit sticky from time to time with who gets to be the first author on a certain publication and that order of authorship. So that's also something when you get to the point as you're maybe mapping out what publications or what you think you are going to produce from the project, to consider not only who's an author, but how are you going to manage some of that order of authorship for the different things. I saw a lot of good stuff going by in the chat related to Trello, which is another tool. Trello is really nice and visually appealing. Color coding really looks cool. Yeah, so authorship agreements, which can be tricky. It's hard with colleagues, right? To be fair and also to try to set some ground rules. And as you heard from Oliver's story, sometimes the power dynamic is such that it's really difficult for a person to have recourse if they're their advisor, their supervisor is the one who's in the situation with them. Yeah, it's common to have the mentor name second or last. Yes, I've heard that as well, that sometimes the first one on the list is very important, and then sometimes the senior scientist or the senior mentor is the last on the list, and that's also an important place. So that's a good point too. Are you game for another one? I know you love this elevator music that comes on. It's really kind of fun. So we have one here. This one is a little bit different. The professor, I'll just set it up first. The professor guy is the same actor as before, but this other fellow who's in this video is his postdoc. So now we have the different relationship going on, and that's important to know just to set it up ahead of time. So we'll watch one more here. This also has to do with publication, but a little bit different spin on what to think about. And thank you so much for all of your great discussion so far. We're just going to keep that up. And this one again is about 2-ish minutes long. So as you're watching it, think about what are the issues at stake with these folks, and what do you think the recommended course of action might be?
I think we should submit here first.
It could be a long shot.
Yeah, but if we get rejected, then we'll submit to the lower impact journals. We'll just move down the list.
That approach could take a while.
But it guarantees that we'll be published in the best journal possible.
It could be years.
We need to be taken seriously. It's important for our grants.
I understand that. It's just that I'm a little concerned about my family. You know, my wife really wants to move back to India. She wants the kids to be around family, and for that she really needs my help.
I understand. I really do. I've been there. But a good journal will bode well for both of us. You're going to need it when your fellowship is done.
I know, I completely understand. I'm just wondering if at all we could select a slightly less competitive journal this time.
I don't want to shortchange our work. We need the credibility. We want those conference invitations.
I know, but I'm trying to balance my life. I'm wondering if at all a top-tier journal will really make that much of a difference at this point.
Why settle for beer when you can have champagne?
I like beer.
I think it's time you try champagne.
If you insist.
I do.
All right, I think I'm going to come off of the screen share just so I can see your wonderful faces a little bit better. There we go. Much better.
I can say I pulled some bad faces watching that confidently. Right, Samir?
What's wrong with beer? Yeah, that's a good question. So a little bit different issue at stake in this vignette that we just saw. Really good comment, Jordana. Minimizes and bulldozes his colleague with inferiority tactics. Yeah, that's tough. What all did you think were the issues at stake, maybe for each of the two individuals there?
I think what got me first was the comment. I've been there when he was talking about his wife wanting to move back to India. Do we know that? Are you sure? Is that really relating to my experience, or is it dismissing what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting interpersonal dynamic there. Now, Leslie says differing priorities. He's glazing over someone who chooses to express his immediate needs. Yeah, so why does the professor guy want to go for the top tier journal? What do you think his motivation is? Ego and fame. Anything else?
Well, he's going after grant money. If he's a professor, he needs grant money for next year, and the top journal will give him grant money. I started out with 50 PhD students when I was getting mine. We ended with 35 of them. Very similar to this, where people they didn't want to do the work to get to the top tier journal, and they got kicked out. You had to work hard, but it would take 2 to 3 years sometimes to get published.
Mm-hmm.
I had one that took like almost 3 years before it was published, and like I forgot about it. And you submit it, like I forgot about it until it was published, and it's like wow. But it's a tough situation. But yeah, the professor I can see going for a different route than the other guy. But I feel for him too, because he's got a life to lead, and trying to balance family and research work. Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, and Samir made a comment, I don't like how he closed the door and discussed his own needs. Yeah, I've watched that one several times now, and it's increasingly, I notice the body language more and more. You know, that he closed the door, he's sitting on the desk, and he's looking down at the other person. There's just a lot going on there with the power differential in the situation. And I think personality conflicts, yeah, I think you're exactly right, Oliver, that the way the professor sees it is we have to be in this top tier reputation journal because we're going after the next grant, we're going after the next money. Maybe he's, just based on my inference from the video, he might not have tenure yet, or he's, you know, early enough that he's really concerned about those kind of factors. But you also have, in this case, a postdoc who's essentially a junior colleague that's not very far different in terms of experience and maybe place in, you know, life, who also has a family, who also has, you know, priorities for himself. So when you, this situation, you know, the way that it's constructed may or may not come up, but you may be in a group and you're thinking about, okay, well, where do we send this thing? Yeah, so Samir's pointing out, and that's true in some doctoral programs, sending out manuscripts for publication and writing a dissertation in your manuscript format. That's definitely common in some fields. Ed, do you want to say something more about transformational leadership versus transactional?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a textbook case of where, you know, one is leading in a way where he wants to convince based on that transaction, if you will, versus one that's kind of a little bit more submissive and kind of just trying to play the part to appease, where I think in most cases where I find in business, for example, some leaders with their ego and pride will talk nothing but about the transaction or the dollars versus mentoring and guiding through a way that's a little bit more servant related. So that was my observation in this relational exchange. And that's why I just pointed out the difference between a transformational leader versus a transactional one. It even has something to do with it being more of a servant leader as well. That's just a point I wanted to make.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And seeing those styles come through and priorities, even in this, you know, research-based situation, and just shows sort of the applicability and how those dynamics in those contexts, you know, play across different areas of our lives, you know, including sometimes, you know, in a research context where you're all colleagues and you're trying to work together, but there can be challenges at play. So let's step back for a moment and think just tactically about, so you've been working on a project, you know, how do you come up with a strategy for where to send that for publication. How would you recommend doing that in a group?
I've been there in the last few years, and it's difficult because someone really wants to get it out there right now. It's a really a low class journal. Not even sure it's a real journal, and the rest want to, get to a real high level publication, and it can get messy in discussing it, and they're still part of the team. You just got to keep talking, and hopefully, but the thing is, the same issues we saw here. One may want to have it published right away to make their mama happy. I don't know, but or make their job better wherever they work. And it is tough, but it's communication. I just got to really, like we're doing here, sit down and turn the microphone on and say hi, and try to convince the group the group convinces where the group is going. You started doing this research for a reason. Maybe go back and say, listen, we were trying to do it, and here we want to get published and get a nice name for ourselves. It just takes a lot of talking sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that. And Sherry also added going back to setting the expectations early. And I think to your point, Oliver, when people come into that part of the process, they might have different motivations for their timeline. Maybe somebody's thinking, well, 8 months from now, I have to submit my rank advancement package, and I would really like this to be closer to being out the door or be accepted at least, and so they have this idea of timeline in their minds, and they're thinking about where they can go for that purpose, versus it's not that timeline and reputation are always opposed, but looking at the balance of the type of journal and their editorial process and the typical timelines. Yeah, I like Pamela's note about having expectations and a checklist of talking points to kind of work through those things. Yeah, absolutely, because sometimes the publication process can be quite slow, or you may get a revise and resubmit, but it's a substantial revise and resubmit, and then that takes additional time as well. So it is probably ongoing conversations, but really thinking up front about what are the different people's priorities and what target journals might make the most sense. If it's a big enough project where maybe there's a possibility of several publications over time from that, maybe the strategy is a little bit different for the various publications based on maybe a slightly different subfield, for the journal being selected, or a different type of journal, in terms of exclusivity type of things. So yeah, although it was a very awkward interaction, I have some empathy for both people's positions in that conversation, and find that it's a difficult thing to work around. So who's writing in the reputation of the senior faculty? Yes. That is absolutely true. So I'm going to show you the site where this came from, because there are some other really nice resources that you might find interesting for yourself or your students. I will say, for the videos that I just showed you, they have them available for download. And I did download them because they were not closed captioned, and I was trying to add the closed captioning in. So they have some other resources though that are pretty cool. So let me bring up one more thing here. So this is the main website which I can grab and I'll just stick in the chat for you. Off of the main website, what I was looking at was the RCR resources. And under that, one that I really like, which is what I have on this page, is the research clinic. Now this could be a teaching tool, although I know I see Kat Fisney on here. I have gone through it. It does have closed captioning, but I don't know how well it does with screen readers, so we'd have to get it checked. But it's a branching scenario, like a simulation, where you can go into this research study and you can play any of these characters, and each of the characters is presented with different dilemmas, different choices along the way, and it's amazingly complex. You can go down lots and lots of different paths to explore what happens in the study from these different people's perspectives. And a lot of really important issues come up in terms of, you know, expediency and the integrity of collecting the data and how it's reported and the grant applications and all of that. So this is a really good resource. And then where I got these videos from is the case studies and the video case studies. There's also some really nice videos with another grad student in here, so you get a little bit of that perspective as well. So these are good resources that I have found useful, and that might even be good talking points when you're starting off as a research group, just to say, well, hypothetically, if this happened, what would we do? Or could we prevent this situation from happening by anticipating it up front? And to me, those are really nice resources to look at. And I find them very helpful. So I did want to share where these came from, so that if you want to use them, you can also go out and find them. So there's obviously many other things we could talk about in terms of research collaboration, but I think I wanted to sort of hone in on some of those issues today around what happens when you're collaborating and trying to get to that point of authorship, and who gets to be an author, and then the decision-making process around trying to find appropriate places to publish and present. And as I said at the beginning, researchers are people too, and we saw that very clearly in these examples. They had their own ego, they had their own problems, they had their own motivations and their own priorities, and that plays into the process as well. So, you know, as we all go forth and are working with different people, it's just something to keep in mind, to be intentional about your channels of communication and the planning process, so that you can anticipate and be as productive as possible going through the research process, and have a good outcome on the other end, which is, you know, getting the publications or presentations that you're hoping for, and enjoy the process, you know, rather than, you know, having these conflicts. So thank you everyone for being here. We do have some more sessions between today and tomorrow, as well as the on-demand sessions and the recorded student lightning talks. So take a look at those, and thank you so much.
One more question, one more statement. You mentioned, I think it was yesterday, I've been in all of these sessions. Would you mention again about the problem of submitting your article to more than one peer-reviewed publication? You don't do that.
Right, that's a very important part to say, okay, once you get something in, it's in the submission process, it has to work its way through. You know, it either has to be, you work it through and revise and resubmit and get it through to the end, or you can withdraw it at some point in the process if you really have to. It's not really the ideal thing, but you could withdraw it. Or, you know, worst case, it gets rejected and they just say it's not a good fit for the journal, we're not going to take it. Then you can go elsewhere. But it really is a one at a time process for sending things out. Thank you, Oliver. And thank you, everyone. Really good to see you. I'll catch up to you later.